start, I'll move the new motion that's on the screen, so that gives you some time to read that, and gives also Kataraina and Deborah the opportunity to reflect on that motion, which I think they've seen. And got a second in Councillor Hulse, and just want to say that this motion is been under consideration for a few days, and working through this with the Mayor and the Mayor's office, myself, and in response to giving this some greater urgency and direction. Kataraina, would you like to lead, and welcome Phil?
Afternoon, councillors. I know you've had a long day, so I'll just very briefly outline the scope and then just leave it open for questions. So the scope of this report is quite tightly focused on affordable housing, which is assisted rental and assisted ownership. However, that is couched within the wider housing system, as people often need a range of housing at different times. So we're trying not to be closed to the wider housing that goes on both in the market and public housing. The focus will be on working with other partners within the system. You'll see we've put quite an emphasis on collaboration. That's because there are many other people delivering this, such as community housing providers, the government, and there are a range of government agencies who are perhaps working on this topic right now, and we need to be able to see where they think they're going with their plan. We also know that the Independent Māori Statutory Board is working with Te Matapahi to lead a Māori housing plan, so it'll be critical for us to also link with that. You'll see from the scope that it covers both regulatory and non-regulatory interventions. So the regulatory ones do cover the things you're experienced with and worked in the past. So we will be looking at all the previous work undertaken through the draft unitary plan. We'll be looking really carefully at what's been successful through the SHAs, and we'll be trying to make sure we're making best use of others' work in order to pull this together quite quickly. You'll see that we do have a risk identified in the report around non-delivery due to the need to actually work with stakeholders on this, and there are quite a large range from developers through to community housing providers, so that is the one thing we identified as a risk. You can see the mitigation measure is to try and iterate our advice to you and to work within the needs and timeframes of our partners.
Thank you, Kataraina. Questions at this stage? Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, just really important. Thank you for your presentation. I'm referring to, just to be clear, a couple of clause 6 that talks about the report talking about some key themes from literature, and I think it carries on the same theme in clause 24 around New Zealand international examples of affordable housing policy, right? So I just want to understand, in the report, are we going to examine at all how a compact city, the ideology of that, in terms of a policy, is the effect that that's had on affordable housing, either providing it or otherwise? Was that in the scope? That was the first question, then I had another one.
So we intend to look at a range of decisions Council's already made and what impact that is already having on affordable housing. For example, by allowing secondary dwellings through the unitary plan, that has actually enabled a form of affordable housing. We will go through a range of those, so we'll look at how density helps, how density bonuses. One of the things that we really will look at, if you look at one of the bullet points, is how will those things often work together. So it's the interaction of incentives and sanctions. So internationally you might see that actually a housing policy or strategy actually assists with specific methods you use, and sanctions and planning controls working together often is what can really transform areas to enable affordable housing. So we will be coming back to trying to look at things much more in a systematic way.
Okay, Okay, no, that's great. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to check on that. And the second question through you, Mr. Chair, was just, and I mentioned this the other day, and I think the Chair mentioned that today would be the appropriate time to raise it, that there were some other reports that are international reports and or have looked at best practice that I'm aware of. And I just wondered if these were in scope, either yes or no, really. Either they will be or they won't be. The Productivity Commission did a report on affordable housing. Was it? I just wondered if that was going to be in part of your research. Shall I mention the three for you?
Yep.
So it was the Productivity Commission. Infrastructure New Zealand have been to the States recently, and they've done a paper on their experiences and findings in the USA. And I'm also aware that the New Zealand Initiative, another group, a think tank, has done a report around that. Those are just three I'm aware of. There might be others, but because I've read those papers, I was just wondering if they were in scope of papers you're aware of included conclusions.
Yes, and that is part of trying to do this quickly by looking at others' work. We will, though, be applying a kind of intervention criteria. So, for example, we'll look at, was there evidence for the things people have suggested? Is there evidence that this is promising or emerging, or is there actually really strong evidence that this can work? So we will take an analytical view of some of those reports, though.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. And I've just had another question come to mind, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, and that's, I guess you start off by saying affordable housing really related to assisted rentals and assisted ownership. Okay. Is that, and those things are government assisted schemes, aren't they in your paper? So I'm just trying to support the resolution, Mr. Chair, just trying to really understand our role in this. Is our role to get this report so we can digest, so we can feed back into these processes, or are we muddling the waters a little bit and starting to step into central government territory?
Look, I'll let Katarina, I've got my response to that,
Okay.
but I think it's fair to have our officer respond to that.
Thank you.
So this is the space between social housing, which the government's now calling public housing, and market housing. It is normally provided by community housing providers who are able to access government's accommodation supplements. So the Selwyn Foundation, that's one of the reasons why they now run our council pensioner homes, because they can access the accommodation supplement. So that means that people who live in those homes access that accommodation supplement. So that it generally is provided by community housing providers who can access subsidies. Not always though, some of the ownership schemes are quite different. Ngāti Whātua, Waiparata Trust are doing quite a lot of that provision. So it does vary a bit, but it tends to be not government. It tends to be more, they're still kind of more charitable based organisations who can access government supplements often. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
And sorry, regulatory mechanisms, potentially like planning mechanisms, can allow for space and developments for those kind of community providers to kind of occupy and provide affordable housing, which is assisted rental and assisted ownership. So sometimes without the space for them to undertake that, they would all be potentially at market rental. So it kind of enables a different type of tenure.
That was very helpful.
And we have a role in that, obviously.
And we have a strong lever in that, yes.
Member Henry, please.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Look, I've just got some questions. If you look at bullet point 16 on page 90, is it? Specifically point 2 and point 4 of bullet point 16. What's council done specifically on those 2 points? Have we got information, or do you have information specifically on those points?
Through the Chair, if you have a look at the context to which paragraph 16 is couched, it is from, of course, the Auckland Plan 2050, which is a plan for Auckland, not just Council's role. That's taken from the plan to show that the housing system requires all the players across it in order to start looking at their part to play and how we can coordinate and collaborate to do that. So that's what that area is referencing.
Okay, so if you go to point 4, investing in Māori to meet their specific housing aspirations, that's taken from the statement that's taken from the 2050 document?
Yeah.
Okay, but there's no sort of how to get there, but that's part of what this is.
Well, some of it, for example, is highlighted in the resolution amendment to the item before this, where through both the unitary plan we are enabling papakainga to be established more easily. You've seen us invest in Te Hinga Marae, which potentially will include papakainga. That was an investment of land. We have capability and capacity building undertaken through the Program Development Office, where we have specific Māori grants to assist that. We work with Ngāti Whātua around providing advice, Waiparata Trust. So there is a lot of different things going on. I acknowledge it can be difficult to have those visible, and as part of the December report back, we can make those much more visible.
Cool. On bullet point 24, it refers to the IMSB and Matapihi-led Māori housing plan. It's actually, can we get that changed to IMSB and Matapihi-led plan on housing outcomes for Māori? Because that's what it is. It's not a Māori housing plan.
Okay.
Bullet point 31 about a meeting on the 11th. IMSB would like to be part of that, if at all possible.
We'll make sure you get an invitation.
Cool. It also talks about in the report bringing all the strands together. Do we have access to everything? Like, I know the MB are doing stuff on the development of some sort of master plan. I know that the Minister's doing some stuff as well through HNZ. Do we have a hook into all of those as well, or are we not yet privy to what they have got on the back of their minds?
So through the Chair, we have some really good hooks into some of those systems. We, of course, have been working with government and NGOs on a cross-sectoral homelessness plan for Auckland. The one rider, though, we have put in the report. If you look at paragraph 37 and 38, you'll see that with all these government things going on, they are quite busy at this time of the year. There is the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development that has just been established like yesterday or the day before. So one of our concerns is that they are quite busy, and that makes it sometimes difficult to access the most up-to-date knowledge, and so we can fill in that system map. I think we can get it a good 80% done, and we will just have to be flexible about how quickly things are changing in terms of government announcements. And I think we're just going to have to be nimble and flexible about sometimes not knowing exactly what's going on. I would hope, though, that many of you, with your contacts in government, would also be a source of perhaps what is going on.
It's your turn, Mr. Mayor.
I'll reserve my comments till we open it up for comments.
Hey, I think two more. Are you confident that August 2019 is going to be soon enough?
No,
We've
that's why
changed
the
that.
sorry to interrupt. The recommendations aren't assuming that we stick with August. We're saying March
Oh, okay,
for the
cool.
position and role report.
Oh, cool.
And thanks for picking that up.
And last one, given, and I'm not sure whether you were here for Ben's corridor about the issue of affordability and you know, having that walk up, having that employment, the retail, education, recreation, and the transport links to housing. But it seems to me that there needs to be a bit of work done in what we are doing around that whole affordability and transport, how transport and the others make affordable housing affordable. Are we going to take the opportunity to look at that? Because I think we should, given that you know, the state of emergency in terms of you know, housing.
So we will be looking at evidence of great transport links and other things and how they impact on affordability and what might be required to manage or mitigate some of that impact.
Because I only say that because I'm born and bred in Otara, and Otara was built without a whole lot of, I mean, crikey, it was 15, and I was 15 when we got our first dairy up the road from us. So that's all those sorts of things that I'm worried about. You can build a whole lot of houses, but if you can't get there or you can't get out, my mother and her neighbours used to bike up to Papatoetoe because we didn't have a retail centre. So, yeah, cool.
Yep. So we'll make sure we're looking at how we enable quality affordable housing.
Cool. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely, that's critical. Thank you. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Just a question and a comment. First of all, comment, thoroughly endorse B. My only concern is that the advocacy needs to be strong and well informed, and I'm assuming that there'll be a piece of work around that as best we can. The other issue I have then just goes to the position and role report. Will the matter of affordable housing provisions be part of the position and role report?
Yes. Katarina.
Through the chair, do you mean the planning provision parts?
Well,
Or
whatever you're
talking more
coming back to
broadly?
us on. I mean, here it says position and role report, collaboration results with stakeholders, intervention analysis, options and advice. I'm assuming that a retained affordable housing will be part of that package?
Having a look at a range of mandatory minimum requirements that could be enabled through planning provisions will come back as part of the report. Yes.
Great.
Thank you. Katarina, thank you for your paper, and Deborah in support as well. And you will have noted some changes that we're recommending in the motions before us that adjust the delivery of the snapshot and then the position and role reports. Now, it might be a little bit ambitious, but we need to be ambitious. Do you have capability to deliver on the Roman 2 particularly?
So yeah, Roman 2 is a bit easier for us to achieve than Roman 1.
Well, I mean, I think you did indicate that the Roman 1 was going to be coming in December 18, which would have been at the very beginning of the month, and we're probably asking you to come 1 week prior on the snapshot report. I would have thought the Roman 2 was the challenge.
I suppose the one thing I'd say to the committee is when we bring information back, you normally want everything, the most robust. We've talked to the most stakeholders. We've checked everything with them 2 or 3 times. So we will come back with something more fit for purpose that may not have been as engaged as well as it would have been with an August deadline. So it will be a solid fit for purpose platform, and then we might have to do a bit more work after that and a lot more engagement. So it's doable. It's just you know, we'll just have to manage our expectations just a little bit around how much engagement we can also do with others.
Okay. Well, look, I just want to speak to this motion, and then I think there's some others that want to ask questions and also speak to it. A lot of work has been done in this area. I think there is a lot of international studies on this. We've examined this minutely ourselves, as we well know, and it dates back a long way. So I think it's more than urgent, and that's why we are asking the staff to pull out all the stops to bring this forward and get this report in front of us in 2 reports. And I've just looked back at where this maybe did start from, the debate on affordable housing, and I discovered in the last day or so that there was actually legislation in place that enabled territorial authorities to consult with their communities and require developers to have so-called retained affordable housing. And that legislation goes back to a body of work that a select committee of inquiry into housing affordability of 2007 considered, after discussing it since about 2004, 5 and 6. That housing inquiry, affordable housing inquiry, was undertaken. That led to the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act 2008. And when I read that act yesterday, I was really surprised to see the draft provisions that were lost in the unitary plan, pretty much mirrored. And here, 10 years on, we don't have such ability to require affordable housing in perpetuity. And I think that's the thrust of what we're after here. It's not just the provision of housing by supply, and it's not just the provision of affordable housing, it's the provision of affordable housing in perpetuity in specific locations as well, because we're at risk of just having maybe housing, market or affordable, on a route like the light rail route that we've just discussed earlier today, but in time it just becomes gentrified, and in time it just becomes market housing, and there is no affordability that is retained in perpetuity. And it's interesting to read that legislation, and it was highlighting problems back then of a 700% increase in land prices in Auckland between 81 and 2004. Median house price that was 6.4 times the median income. And it goes on that house ownership in Auckland had fallen to 56%. And now 10 years later, or 8 to 10 years later, we are actually just updated those numbers, and we're still facing the same problem because no one actually dealt with the issue back then. Now, the government of the time did actually deal with it by putting legislation in place, but that was repealed a year later. And the reasons for the repeal were that releasing land would solve the problem and adding supply would solve the problem. And we know that is not correct. And even the independent hearings panel said, when it rejected the retained affordability housing provisions, it noted the plan on its own is not able to deliver affordable housing. Yet its reasons for knocking it out were that supply would take care of it. There were contradictions littered all over the place. And this, over the last 10 years in Auckland, I'd have to say this has been a complete muddle. And we've done our best in this place, I think, but we haven't had friendly partners. And I also looked at the submissions that were against this council, where we tried to put retained affordability provisions into our unitary plan, and those submissions actually came against us from the government. Against us from the government. And why do we face this affordability problem in Auckland? Well, I think there's answers all over the place over the last 10 years. And look, time is short, so that's why a number of us, and I've heard the discussions around this table, real concern about the lack of grabbing this challenge and dealing with it. And there are a lot of ways that this could be addressed. It's not just retained affordability and so-called inclusionary zoning provisions. There's probably a lot more. The motion here suggests that in the first instance we should approach the government. Rather than do another plan change, at least we sound the government out as to what its intentions. Would it like to dust off old legislation of its own making and update it? Would it like to update a national policy statement and reflect that call for affordable housing through a national policy statement? I think there's a lot of avenues to be explored here. I won't list what else we've got underway. Members, you can see that through the memo that went out yesterday. But I'm sure the Mayor's got something to add here, but there is an absolute political determination from me and Councillor Hulse, the Mayor, and a number of other councillors who have approached me that we need to knock this off. Time is absolutely up on this issue, and I invite our staff to bring forward reports, the initial report and the follow-up report in March, that explore lots of options, look at the international research and bring us some options to explore, but at all times be doing this with our key partners, not just government, but iwi, private sector and community housing organisations. We have to address this, members. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm conscious of the time and it's been a long day for everybody, so I'm not going to go over old ground. But what I want to draw attention to are the amendments that have been moved by the Chair and seconded by Councillor Hulse. If we do the whole scope of affordable housing, it's a big job. And some of that has been tackled already by the Mayoral Housing Task Force. But what we wanted early was a particular focus on the question of inclusive house zoning, which we ran under the special housing areas, the SHAs, but then dropped at the request of the independent hearing panel. And I've been over the recommendations of the independent hearing panel, and frankly, they perhaps deliberately simply reflected the thinking of the day and the government of the day, and I don't think they hold water. It was a case of setting up straw men and then knocking them over. But I understand why the council of the day probably felt they could not resist that particular context that they were working in. You see, what the independent hearing panel did was it said, actually, don't do your inclusionary zoning because it's really a demand and supply problem. And of course, in a very large part, it is a demand and supply problem. If you've got far more supply than you've got demand, that will push the price of rent up and it'll push the price of properties up. But it's not an either or, it's a both and. I think, you know, we've seen some real progress with Kiwi Build. I think that is part of the solution. I think our increasing the supply, the unitary plan and the great work that Penny Hulse did on that's part of the problem. Finding new building methods like prefabrication and bringing down the cost of construction materials, that's part of the solution to it. But I don't believe that we should ignore the concept of inclusionary zoning. It operates in a great many countries around the world. In London, the requirement for affordable housing is 50% of all houses. Now, I'm not sure that the council got the formula right when they put it up to the as part of the Auckland Unitary Plan. I think we should have a look at that formula and see if we can't improve on it. I reckon we probably can improve on it to make sure that it's viable, but it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be putting pressure on for inclusionary housing. We sat around and we listened the other day to Waiparera Trust, and most of us around the table felt we didn't want to have 100% social housing. But I, you know, that was my very strong view. I didn't think that was a good idea. But what we do need is for the vast majority of areas is to try to do, as they do right across Europe, create communities that consist of different tenures and different income levels. And I believe we can do that. If you talk to the Hobsonville Land Company, HLC, they will say, we have achieved our 10% in Hobsonville easily. And I've been through it. And the cheaper houses are deliberately created. They don't stick out, but they are more modest and they are smaller. But it means that you get a cross-section of people of different income levels in the community. And I think we need to explore that. And why we've got Little Roman 2 there is because, you know, you can't do all of the work in the next couple of months. But if we get you to focus on that aspect, international analysis, international practice, the data that's available, we're also debating that on the Mayoral Housing Task Force. I think that we can make some progress and we can look at that again. Not on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of evidence and what works and what sort of communities and what sort of places we want to create. So I very much support the amendments that have been made there. I think that we should challenge the IHP. I mean, I want to finish on this. The panel notes that it's open to property owners to provide dwellings for rent or sale at below market values. That's a piece of ideology. Nobody's going to do that unless we make that a requirement. And I think that we can do that, and I think that we should do that if the principles we agreed to collectively around the table in the Auckland Plan about creating an inclusive society are to mean anything at all. This is one mechanism, one part of the jigsaw puzzle. We need to get it right. We need for it to be evidence-driven, and that's really what we're asking officers to do. So I support the recommendations, Mr Chair, that you've moved and Pennyholes has seconded.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, and I absolutely agree with what you and the Mayor have said. This is one of those really, really challenging issues, you know, and it is the old, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die, you know, and we've done an awful lot of hand-wringing about affordability, and we all nod when people come and tell us about affordability, and then when the rubber hits the road and we say, okay, put your money where your mouth is, you know, inclusionary zoning and affordable housing coming to a place near you soon, there's an awful lot of looking at the ceiling and foot shuffling and, you know, and oh-butting. So I've just got a couple of points. I am just a little bit worried that we open up that whole issue that Councillor Sayers has raised about the Productivity Commission and the value cost of compact city and all the rest of it. We've done that to death. I think this work is, you know, we can quote that, but I think we're a little bit distracted if we make that the focus of the work we're doing, because the Productivity Commission have told us mostly that just by building more houses the price will come down. The Productivity Commission is kind of the advice that the Independent Hearings Panel got. The advice the Independent Hearings Panel got was the, you know, compact cities putting the price up. So, you know, I think we need to move on from that if we're actually going to make change, Mr Chair. As you've said, it's time that we did something. I'm a little bit worried that we're sort of conflating a whole lot of issues into one place, and the report that we've got is excellent, and the fact that we are looking at assisted rental and assisted ownership, fantastic. Let's focus on that, because that's going to make the fundamental difference. The reality is, however, that we did allow inclusionary zoning to kind of slip through our fingers. We were dealing with, I think as you and the Mayor put it, a government who were not comfortable with that. We got it into the SHAs with a lot of, wedged it into the SHAs, and not with some difficulty, but it certainly was thrown out at the panel process. So I think we should look at inclusionary zoning. So my one request to you, the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, is as part of the Housing Task Force, you've got a captive group of friendly developers. We aren't going to get this anywhere without the group of developers actually being our advocates. Things have changed. A lot's happened in 3 years. The same developers that said this will send them to the wall are now developers who can see the way forward. The old Hobsonville Land Company, or Homes and Lifestyles and Communities, or whatever it is now, you know, good on Chris. Yep, they could do it. they weren't the kind of developer who's holding all the risk, who's mortgaged their house and who's holding, you know, the bank at bay, trying to stand up a development. So I suggest, you know, we pat Chris and Hobsonville Land Company on the back and go, good on you, you've done good work, but let's talk to the real hard-ass developers who are really doing the hard yards with this and convince them, and we'll get it across the line. Last word on this, I think this probably is one of the most important things that we'll do this next year. And I guess I challenge councillors to put your money where your mouth is. You know, we all voted the other day for this slightly friendly and vaguely fluffy notice of motion for, you know, let's build more affordable houses. This is how we're going to do it. So, you know, if you voted for that, you're going to have to support this process as it unwinds over the next few months. And finally, I just want to acknowledge our crack team that we've got there of staff putting this together. This is not an easy business, but I could not have more confidence in the team that are working on this. Kia ora, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for leading this.
Thank you, Councillor Holson. Thanks for your input over the last couple of days, particularly. And now Councillor Simpson.
Well, hopefully I didn't go a bit earlier because I'm not quite as positive, I'm sorry. What concerns me about this is that I've heard Katarina, who I respect a lot, and you do a great job, say that the Roman numeral recommendation in A is a concern for her. And I suppose when I listen to your response to that, I totally agree. If I'm going to get a report, I want everything in it. You're saying, actually, you're going to be challenged to do it by the date given. So I'm not happy about that, and I actually want to support you and give you the time that's needed. I'm not asking for, you know, the world. I don't think you're asking for it either. You've said in your report that you expect to have it by December, but if it was January, it was January. So I'm going to abstain, and it's not because I don't believe that there should be something done, but I just think that we're actually channeling staff to potentially give us a report that they are saying themselves that they're not comfortable with from a time frame. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sayers?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, a lot has changed in 3 years, and I think if we're going to have this report, I'd certainly want the expectation that was a very open, transparent, honest report. Picking up on the points of Councillor Simpson there, you'd certainly want a report with everything in it. I think we have to be brave. Things have moved on. If it's a warts and all type report, which I'm hoping it would be, then we need to be able to digest that and look at those international best practices and the thinking. So look, I'm just, I would hope the report is robust and it does look at those best practices, and it's not an exercise in cherry picking certain aspects.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. And very briefly, support recommendations, support the way forward. I will, however, just request that that TPK, and I know they weren't mentioned in there, but TPK, because Papakainga has been spoken about through the whole day, and it's interesting that they currently have $20 million in there for Papakainga. There's an extra 15 million. I went down to Wellington with Te Maruata, which is the local government. So around the affordable housing, but Papakainga especially about getting Māori into it. Just wanted to put that forward. Also, Councillor Hulse was a few years ago, but there's an item went in to the Community Development and Safety Committee meeting in 2015. And it's around the Turanga project, and I'm hoping that our staff don't lose sight of the Turanga project. Turanga project was a project that helped our Pacific families around literacy and getting them into their first home. They had 15 families from 2014 through to 2017. 5 of them, through the project that Councillor Hulse launched, actually went into their first home. And when I was in Wellington 2 weeks ago, spoke to Peter Courts, who is the General Manager Community for the Commission for Financial Capability. And they're also looking at something for the community around financial literacy, because we're talking about affordable housing. Here are some initiatives that we should be at least looking at again to assist our families, our whānau into housing. So look, I again just fully support the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor Filipaina. Raina?
Just in response to your comments, and that's what we mean when we talk about a systems approach. So whilst not everything will able to be in these reports, it is a long-term project in a way, because actually just focusing on housing supply doesn't help those whose incomes aren't moving. So we do know for Māori and Pacifica particularly, it is education, 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 so you can get jobs that pay more, therefore you can meet the market more. So, you know, over the long term, we do need to look at those and the role that the Southern Initiative and the Western Initiative can play in there, particularly when they've already been piloting those types of capability building.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And just, councillor Bartley, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Just a question. Will you also be looking at Tamaki Regeneration, since we're 49% shareholder?
Yes, we will, councillor. I think we've got quite a few examples in Auckland where people will tell us what's working well, what's not, and what do we need in the longer term. What we do know is they will be very clear about what role they think council can play and how we can use our levers better as well. So every development we've got that has mixed development has got something to share with us in terms of what we can all learn.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that closes the debate. Thank you for all your contributions, members. Councillor Simpson, the proposal by the officer, by Karaina's team, was to bring it to the December meeting. We don't have a December meeting on the 4th. It would have ordinarily fallen on the 4th. It's 1 week prior. That's the only difference. It's 1 week prior. And
I just heard her say she wasn't comfortable with it, and I just don't think it, you know, what's a month? I mean, I'm not saying it's something that shouldn't be done, but I was just trying to give a vibe.
It was
okay.
Because a long time.
Just in response to that, what we think we can do though is it would be great at that meeting. Sometimes if you can go, actually we want a deeper dive here sometimes, and we don't need a deeper dive here, and therefore any work we carry on for the March report will be based off the December one, and we'll get that real feel for actually this is our real focus. Please go and spend a lot of your time finding more about this. So, I mean, that's the way we can manage that time frame.
I'll stick with my vote, thank you.
Direction setting.
Thank you. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. Declare that carried.
I'd like it recorded, thanks.
And thank
And
you.
I've got mine.
Karaina, thank you. Deborah, thank you. Phil, thank you. Members will go now back to
11.
Sorry, can I just